This is Jonathan Zapp of Zapp Oracle and Reality Sandwich, and I'm here at the International Congress on Consciousness in Miami, and I am talking to Sandy Coy, who is an entomologist, and there's kind of a remarkable chain of synchronicities I'm following here. I think it was a week or 10 days ago I was watching Charlie Rose, and he had the famous historian on. I think his name is David McCullough. And apropos of nothing, when Charlie Rose was asking him about some of the most important events of his life, he said, "I read a book about insects and it just blew my mind." And then at the end of the whole interview, when Charlie Rose asked him what advice because he must be in his 80s, he has for young people, he said, read a book about insects. I mean, I was expecting it to be all about studying history. And so that just kind of stayed with me, and I decided just yesterday, hey, I better read a book about insects, except that most of my books I'm listening to on Audible, so I downloaded a book that was on a lot of the lists of the 10 best books about insects. And so then I just walked over during the lunch break to Whole Foods and took the first stool that was available in a very crowded Whole Foods, and it turned out to be another member of the same conference, Sandy, and who quickly introduced herself as an entomologist. And so that kind of got my attention right away, and she's kindly agreed to do a podcast about insects. And so I want to start by confessing my prejudice against insects. I'm sure this is a very common prejudice that you can disabuse me of, but I wrote a rant about this as a Facebook status update a couple of years ago that, about insects that had some kind of title like "Just because you're part of nature does not make you cool," that insects seem very stereotyped and mechanical and annoying. They don't listen, they don't respect boundaries, and so on and so forth. They don't seem to have new material. They just seem to always be doing the same old golden oldie loops that they've been doing all along. But I want to give you this opportunity to tell us why we should think of insects as conscious, as I suspect they are, and what are some of the things that got me interested in insect consciousness or dramatic evidences of insect consciousness.
That's a really tough question to answer. The first thing I'd like to say is insects are one of the oldest life forms on the planet, and they are, in fact, not just doing nothing. They are the foundation of life on this planet. First foundation, of course, is plants. Plants are very keenly associated with insects, but what people don't realize is that insects are breaking down the nutrients in the soil, breaking down organic matter. They're making soil. They're fertilizing soil. They're aerating soil. They are cleaning the water. They're feeding the trophic levels that go up. So you have little larvae in the water that are feeding the fish. The fish are feeding bigger fish. The bigger fish are feeding humans. And it goes the whole way. So they're associated with the water cycle, associated with the soil cycle, associated with air, everything. They are so key to the ecosystem coherence of the entire planet. So they're not just doing nothing.
But nobody can say that insects don't have a work ethic.
They're they sure do.
They're very industrious creatures, and but we were just touching on this a little bit earlier. I'm very fascinated with the idea of hive consciousness. I know I heard E.O. Wilson, wrote that famous book Insect Societies, say that you can see the dominance of social organism in that the largest percentage of the biomass of the planet would be social insects. And so what can you tell us about hive consciousness and how does that work with the individual? Does it seem like the individual are just sort of following out algorithms or commands, or are they aware of why they're doing what they're doing? How intentionally purposive is it, or does it how much of what they do seems just automated?
I think that they are conscious of what they're doing. As I had said at lunch, if you're building a huge termite colony and it has to have the proper air conditioning and it has to have proper passages and the queen has to be set up so that she's safe, the workers need to know where they're living, the soldiers need to know where's your nursery, the whole thing. So there is some kind of group consciousness going on. They can't. It's like, can you build a building if if the guys that are putting in the floor, the guys that are doing the electrical, the guys that are doing the plumbing, if nobody knows what anybody else is doing? So there has to be some kind of group understanding. And having worked with some of the social insects, in particular termites, I believe that they also have, if you want to call it personalities, they seem to be aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And as I mentioned, we used to take a colony of 100 termites and put them in an arena and just watch what they were doing. Each individual marked so that we know exactly who's doing what. And it was always the same 6 individuals in a colony who were basically the lead workers. And termite colonies are trophylactic. That means they feed each other. So the workers are going to go back and feed the rest of the colony. And it's amazing to me that the same 6 individuals are always the ones that are out there working. Now, whether they work until they die and then another 6 come along, we never got past that point, although I'm sure they have now. But I think there is a group consciousness in those social beings. And as I said, if you lose a cell, your body doesn't stop functioning because you've lost one cell. So if you lose one worker out of your colony because basically they've been worked to death, they work very hard, as you said, so that hive continues going on. So there has to be some kind of a matrix that holds that whole social context together in the hive or in the colony.
So you've observed individual differences and what you even called personalities amongst insects of the same kind. But I guess what I've always wondered is how much does each individual carry that group consciousness? Is it more in the queen than in the worker? Is it something that there's a kind of meta consciousness that's aware of certain things, but the individual components carrying out, like if we had a mainframe that we're sending out these drones, but the drones didn't have to know the big picture, they just had to follow their very specific limited instructions. Do the individual components know what's going on with the overall status of the hive, or how do you think that works?
I think it depends on which social insects you're talking about. With some of them, it is age-related. So, for instance, when you're young and strong, you might be given this assignment, and that's what you do. But then as you get older, maybe you're not able to continue flying 50 meters to get honey, pollen or nectar in order to make honey. So maybe you get assigned to fan the colony to keep it cooled down. Maybe you get assigned to baby care. Maybe you go to the nursery. So I think some of it's age-related depending on whether you are...
Who's giving out those assignments?
I think the colony itself is just, it's an understanding. It just...
Okay. So in other words, that aged bee... there isn't some sergeant or something that's saying that, okay, now you go here, we can see you're not strong enough. It just will decide for itself that I'm not going to be flying the 50 meters, I'm going to be one of the cooling bees or something like that.
I think they all decide together. It's a holarchy.
Okay.
So the queen, now on the other hand, she is the maternal... the maternal entity, so she is the queen. She is the queen bee, literally. So she is the one that's determining a lot of things that go on. Like, do we need to have more workers? Do we need to have more... do we need to make drones because our colony's getting too big and we're going to take off and we're going to start a new colony? And again, I think it depends on the species. Are they ants? Are they bees? Are they termites? Or what social insect are we talking about?
Okay, well, I guess with the example you were just mentioning with the queen, you were talking about bees. So,
I was.
Okay, so let's go with that, just to ground it in one, so it doesn't get so confusing. But so, I guess you could say that the queen has more of the executive function, in this group consciousness. Is that how you see it? And how much does the ones who are not the queen, the drones, the workers, whatever, how much do they participate in that larger consciousness, or do you see them as more like commanded by it, or are they just... Is there any way of distinguishing that, or even an intuitive sense?
I personally can't answer to that, but what I do think is that...
All right, we're back. So, let's see, where were we? We were talking about the queen and how much the individuals possess the full picture. Does it seem like... So it seems like there's a different scope of consciousness with the queen versus the individuals, or is it just that she is playing a role of being the one to make these executive choices, but individuals who are lower on the hierarchy, would they also be aware of the big picture of what's going on in the hive, or just their little piece of it?
I think it's a combination of both, really.
Okay.
But they have to know what's going on in the whole hive.
Okay.
They have to understand what's going on, because if they don't, there's no coherence, and the hive would collapse. Now, one of the things that we think is happening with pesticides, for instance, in the bee colonies, is it is disorienting the bees and disconnecting them from that coherence in the hive.
Okay, so this is the colony collapse disorder you're
It's
talking
part
about.
of it, yes. It's a synergetic thing between all the different things that are hurting the bees.
And do we have a sense, I mean, I know it's associated with nicotinoid...
Neonicotinoid.
Right.
Neonicotinoid. Neonicotinoid. It's like when somebody starts saying...
Pesticides, I mean, is there a specific type of neurological damage that does that would inhibit that function, or do we know anything about why it would cause that breakdown in coherence?
I can't answer as to why it causes that. I just know what the symptoms are. It does mess them up in terms of being able to find their nectar, find their way back to the hive, find their way to communicate with the hive where that honey or where that resource is. Because we know how to interpret their dances. We know how they are telling each other. We know that they learn and that they communicate with each other. And I think one of the things that the colony collapses happens is that they lose the coherence of the whole, the entity of the entire colony, and it disorients them in terms of being able to even function. So it would be, I guess, in a sense, kind of if one of your cells, your liver cell, just stops working, and it just doesn't work anymore.
Sure.
So I think that's part of what's going on. There's a coherence in these colonies that holds them all together. So the queen might be the kingpin, if you want to call the queen the kingpin, but she's the determinant. But everybody is on in that matrix.
Okay. So do they lose coherence if a particular colony has its queen killed, for example? Is that like cutting off the head, or
Well, they'll become disoriented for a while, but they will know that now they have to make a new queen, and they make a queen by feeding the babies, the pupa, royal jelly.
Right.
So they will make a new queen.
Okay. So I guess a reductive scientist, and I am anti-reductive, but just so you can answer this challenge, might say, well, simple algorithms can create very complex looking behaviors. And so if this is all just sort of hardwired in as a sort of a bunch of simple algorithms, and I recently read a book called Simple Rules that goes into like what are the simple rules that allow all these butterflies to cluster together and so forth. So it makes it look very algorithmic, and of course there are very simple learning machines that don't have consciousness or real AI, but they can start to like get better at certain tasks by trial and error, and it just becomes sort of hardwired in there. What is the case for it not being as automated as that and mechanistic?
It's evolutionary for one thing. This is, are we the same? I mean,
Well, of course, some of them would say yes. I mean, I would say no, of course. Because...
But, it's an evolutionary thing. So, yes, if something becomes hardwired, and you had mentioned Rupert Sheldrake earlier about morphic resonance, and I think that's a key part of insect evolution is they are hardwired to do certain things. But so are we.
Right.
So I think that it's a definite long-term thing. They're one of the oldest creatures on the planet. They've been here a very long time, much longer than we have. And I think people need to just remember that these insects are playing a very important role, I think, in the whole matrix of the planet, to be honest with you. Everything from the ants to the whales are part of the song, the coherence of our entire planet, and we've messed with things so badly that I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm worried about it, seriously.
Right.
Colony collapse,
But we may be the colony that collapses while so many insects, people always talk about cockroaches, are more resilient than we are. And besides the famous case of the moths in England that darken their wings to camouflage themselves and
they evolved,
trees.
supposedly, yes.
How well do we see signs of insects adapting to environmental toxins in novel or interesting ways?
In some cases, yes. Some are going extinct. We do know that there are many, many insects who have evolved to metabolize toxins just in the course of their lives. That's what they do. These are novel toxins that we've introduced to the environment. Some of them have switched host plants. Butterflies, for instance, a host plant is what the caterpillars eat. It's called a larval food. So some of them have switched plants. Some animals are making adjustments, and they are doing. I mean, when you think about it, even cockroaches have made adjustments. They're not supposed to live in your house. Their job is to make soil, to break down organic matter and turn the leaf litter in the forest into dirt.
Right.
But now they're in your house, because we're feeding them and we paved over their home, so they're moved in. But I think we all are coming to a point where we have got to make some serious decisions about what we're doing, because we've lost a tremendous amount of species. You know that.
Of course, sure.
So, whether or not, I think insects will survive much better than we will.
Right. Well, as I mentioned before, I'm kind of on the panpsychist side, so I think everything's imbued with consciousness. But I think for materialists, they look at the pinhead-size insect brain and are like, well, there can't be much consciousness in there. But of course, if you're not a neurological materialist, and if you see the brain as a transceiver, which people from way back, William James, saw it that way, and increasingly that perspective seems to be gaining empirical evidence, then the complexity of what's going through a transceiver is not reducible to how many transistors are in the transceiver. So is there anything about the insect brain, however, from the neurological materialist point of view, the architecture of it, anything that gives us an idea of what their consciousness is like? Like, how do they process, like, with a compound eye? Like, how do they process
okay, that's a good place to start.
Okay.
They are living on an entirely different matrix than we are.
Okay.
Some butterflies, for instance, are sensitive to broadband. Now, what are they picking up? We don't know, but they're sensitive to it. Their antennae pick it up when they respond to it. We know that they see UV. We know that they are sensitive to gamma rays. We know that they're sensitive to geomagnetic. How does a butterfly, and we have 38 species here in South Florida that migrate,
Right.
not just the monarch. So people know the monarch, which I'm really glad that people are aware of that now. But we've got 38 species that migrate. How in the world is a little butterfly no bigger than your thumbnail making it from South Florida to Georgia? He's doing that somehow. So yes, it's evolutionary, and this is something that over millions of years has evolved. They're 140 million years old, so they've been around a very long time. But I do know that just like people, I've worked primarily with butterflies. There are butterflies that do seem to have, from our perspective, some kind of personality. We have, for instance, butterflies that seem to be curious. So they'll come up and land on you. Who are you? What are you doing? You know, they'll even crawl around on your face. They'll crawl around on your clothes, just checking you out. Who are you? We have other butterflies that, for instance, the minute you walk into their space, when we're rearing them, they're flying to the other side of the cage. Get me out of here. I don't know who this is. It might be a predator. It might be something going to eat me. And the same is true if anybody who has dealt with cockroaches, who has dealt with, I would call them the higher insects. I'm not sure termites would respond the same way. Although we do know that termites, some of them seem to be more aggressive or outgoing than others. So how do we measure personality in something that we don't even... We've just in the past, I'd say 25 years, begun to even understand the physiology of these animals, which is just incredible. They're incredibly complex. How do you take something like a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly? And what goes on in the pupa is just mind-boggling. You've said a creepy crawly thing on the ground that's turning into this beautiful flying object. Just all of they're called imaginal cells, are in the caterpillar, ready to turn into the butterfly. But these physiological changes and hormone changes have to take place in the pupa to make that happen.
Well, what's also fascinating about that metamorphosis process, from the little I understand, is that the caterpillar cells will have an immunological reaction to the imaginal cells. It'll sort of resist its own metamorphosis until a certain critical point is reached when the imaginal cells take over or something.
Yeah. It's a change in the juvenile growth hormones that takes place, and there is a kickoff point. There is a point, like a critical mass is reached, and it's like, okay, we're going.
And so I think that you may be dangerous to use that as an analog to human evolution, but we see something in biology that we also see with consciousness. Both Freud and Jung talked about the essential conservative aspect of the psyche, and we when there is an evolutionary, and of course organisms tend toward homeostasis, they have a conservative bias to get this dialed in equilibrium, and we see this in cultures where it seems like, okay, there's been an explosion in the rights of women, and so now highly patriarchal cultures, like we find in a lot of fundamentalist Islamic regimes, seem to have been made much worse, and to be aggravated by this evolutionary, they're having an immunological reaction to certain themes of modernity.
Right.
So it seems like there's an analogy. But related to what you were saying about the butterflies and the curiosity, I know I was got a spark of recognition from something I once heard Alan Watts say, where he said that when scientists look at nature and at insects and so forth, they're basically like military men. And so they see everything in terms of engineering and defense, and everything is seen as purposive. And of course, insects are, no doubt, a higher percentage of their behavior is mechanistically purposive as compared to human children, let's say. But maybe not all of it is. I mean, are there moments where it looks like the butterfly is doing something motivated by a curiosity that is not about the classic F's of fighting and food gathering and
I would say so. I would say so, but I can only speak to the butterflies that I have personally known.
Okay.
There do seem to be differences. Now, I reared one little species that was actually thought to be extinct here in South Florida, called an Atala butterfly, Atala, and this is a beautiful, beautiful subtropical butterfly, and we reared them by the thousands in order. Nobody had ever done the biology, the ecological studies. Nobody had ever done anything with behavior, personality. In other words, nobody had done anything in that realm. So actually, for 3 years, I reared them, and by the thousands, literally, and a very huge cage, so that they could pretty much be just what they are. They could, they had free reign. They could mate as they chose. They had food. They had everything they needed. And what I did notice is that there were some. They were all numbered, by the way, so I knew exactly who was doing what all the time. And there were consistently some butterflies that were more outgoing than others, that always came to, the minute they would see me come in with the nectar, they'd be all over me, like, you know, and then everybody else was like hanging off the ceiling and hanging out in the corner. But some of them were like, oh, here's the lady that gives us food. They recognize, and they'd land on your head, they'd land on your clothes. Sometimes they'd land on the nectar bottle, like, hurry up and fill the feeder, I'm hungry.
Right.
You know? And some of them were more successful at mating. Like I said, they were all numbered, so I could tell that this particular individual was much more successful at getting mates than this individual. Some of them were more prolific at laying eggs than others. So it was really an interesting study, not all of which is published yet, but because there was an awful lot of data. But I definitely saw personality differences.
So I guess what a reductivist would say, I mean, you know, chimpanzees are, we now know, 98% genetically
similar
identical to
yes.
us, and yet when, you know, when Jane Goodall gave them names and stuff in her field notes, she was accused of anthropomorphizing. Now, of course, chimpanzees really are highly anthropomorphic, but when you're seeing these differences among insects, reductivists would say, well, you're anthropomorphizing. You're seeing these variations, but maybe it's just sort of some bell-shaped curve where, based on, you know, this, it's to their evolutionary advantage to have ones that are more aggressive and ones that are less aggressive and so forth, based on, like, you know, variations in hormones or something. How much is... are you able to find something that cannot be explained that way? I know Einstein once said, you know, they asked him, can you explain the whole universe mathematically? And he said, yeah, but it'd be like explaining a Beethoven symphony
right.
The variations of air pressure. And of course, now we have neurological materialists who every day we found the brain structure that makes, or the neurotransmitter that makes you fall in love, or the gene or whatever. And I'm never convinced that they really reduced some extremely complex phenomenon to one thing.
Molecules of happiness by Candace Pert. Right.
But, you know, what are some of the most convincing things? I know you talked about higher insects. Like, I'd love to know which are the higher insects, and what are some of the more complex or purposive things you've observed. I know I heard recently that they were able to show that fruit flies make decisions because they were having them fly toward like two different portals or something, and then there'd be like a fraction of a second delay while they had to choose between them, suggesting that perhaps they even had a degree of free will. You know, what are some of the behaviors that you've observed that seem most convincing, and also what are those higher insects that seem like have the most consciousness?
Well, the higher insects are the ones that are the most recent. Butterflies, moths, as opposed to termite, dragonflies, absolutely. And they all have those decision-making abilities. As I said, if I go into the cage, this is a big walk-in cage, so they have lots of room to fly around, choose mates, get nectar, don't get nectar, come up and see me, stay away. So they have a capability to make decisions. They also have a capability to teach each other. So I could watch them. The ones that knew where the nectar was, and the new neophytes, the ones that we just put in the cage, would be watching that's where the food is. Okay, I got it. And then, like, come into the lab in the morning and turn on the lights. It take them a couple of minutes to wake up, and the first thing they go to the nectar feeders, which are like little itty bitty butterfly or hummingbird feeders, but they're made for butterflies. Mm-hmm. So they are making those decisions. Wanted to say something about the dragonflies for a minute. We're going off on a curve here. But they are also migrators. They also migrate. Okay. There's one species of dragonfly called a wandering glider. Puntella flavescens is the Latin. It's a little golden yellow dragonfly that has a global population. They've done genetic studies with this, and we know that it's all one big giant global population. So they've taken samples from Japan, from China, from Russia, from South America. It's all the same DNA. So, and they're called the wandering glider. They are a global population.
But are they considered a social insect? I mean, you wouldn't call that a hive. It's just
no, they're not. They're not social insects, but they are just amazing that they are global. Mm-hmm. There's other butterfly or dragonflies like the green darner that migrates with the birds and is actually one of the top predators of, believe it or not, hummingbirds. It's a very aggressive dragonfly. And dragonflies are one of our older insects. They're very ancient. They have dragonfly fossils from the time of the dinosaurs that had 14-inch wingspan.
Oh, wow. So dragonflies are not one of the newer ones?
No.
Even though they're one of the higher ones?
Yeah. They're incredible.
Okay.
They're incredible.
Well, look, going back to what you were saying about watching the butterflies learn from each other. Now, there's this famous 100-monkey idea. Now we know that the actual case, or at least I've heard it pretty exhaustively debunked, I think in Whole Earth Review, that the actual 100th monkey case turned out to be a hoax or something, or not to be evidential or something. But the underlying idea, I think, and Rupert Sheldrake gives in some of his books evidence of this, that animals seem to be able to learn from some sort of field of consciousness and not necessarily through direct imitation. Have you seen evidence of that, or cases of where insects seem to have like a cultural awareness of some new adaptation or something, where it doesn't have to be transmitted through observation or pheromones or something?
Well, the only thing I can attest to is the ones in my lab.
Okay.
So this is a new experience, but the ones in my lab never had an outdoor experience except for the ones that I collected from the wild to start my colony.
Right.
So in that case, they are learning, and they are learning from each other. Now, if I took those same animals out of the cage, which I did not do, right, but if I were to do that and put them back in the wild, I'm sure that they would know to go to flowers instead of nectar feeders. Mm-hmm. They would know how to do that. And I wouldn't have to teach them how to find a flower.
Well, I guess the interesting experiment, I don't know if anybody's done this, would be if you have artificial nectar feeders of a very particular kind, and you have a whole cage of monarch butterflies that become accustomed to feeding on those, and then if you had like some control group that are just brought in to the next room where they can't observe those, and are introduced to these nectar feeders, will they learn to find them faster than the original group when they were first introduced to them, and there wasn't a cultural memory or field or anything? Has anybody done any experiments like that to see if there's some sort of telepathic network?
Not with the butterflies that I know of, but that sounds like something that another social insect experimenter may have tried.
Right, because something I've always been interested in is just like this precise synchronization, like with flocks of birds and schools of fish. And I know that there are like mechanistic ways of explaining how communication happens, and no doubt there are mechanistic modes of communication like dancing and pheromones and so forth. But are there other types of communication where no traditional causal mechanistic mode of communication is discovered and where it looks like there might be some sort of just telepathic awareness or group awareness?
I would say there probably is. I mean, if you look at a school of fish, if you look at birds, especially migrating birds, because the lead bird somehow, how is that bird chosen? And when that bird gets tired, he just backs off and somebody else takes his place. I mean, before they leave, do they sit around and say, okay, I'm number 1, you're 2, you're 3, you're 4?
Right.
How do they know how to do that? But they do. So there, to me, that tells me that there's some kind of group consciousness and some kind of awareness going on. Yeah.
Okay. Relationships. You know, we talk about social insects, but do we see pair bonding mates where you know, just like birds may mate for life? Do we see anything analogous to that with insects, or that they have a preference for? Do they have friends? Do we ever see any sort of social behavior that is not so highly purposive, but that seems like it's serving some other kind of purpose like that?
To my knowledge, no insect is going to mate for life.
Okay.
In fact, they're probably more, what's the word I want?
Promiscuous
than others. And as far as do they have friends, I have to say, in the lab, I've seen the same guys hang out together. Now, whether they're actually friends and they're like, okay, after we do this, let's go have a sip of the nectar. That I can't answer. You know,
right? Yeah, I mean, because you wonder, do ones that are more genetically similar hang out? Like I have tropical fish in my house, and even if there's only 2 of a kind, they will school together, and no doubt there are good survival reasons for that or whatever. But it seems to run across a great many fish. So I wonder if pairings are based on something that can be explained that way, or so another thing about insect consciousness is it seems that they live on a different time scale than we do. Just like when I started to observe squirrels on my deck, and I started to see how much more intelligent they were, but that maybe I didn't ordinarily perceive that because when a creature runs at a faster tempo, it makes them look like a silent movie. It makes them look more mechanical. But if you slow it down, it looks quite different. There was a French film called Microcosmos that I think showed some time-slowed images of insects that made them seem more chill and more, you know, taking it all in and this type of thing, though that could be just all anthropomorphic illusions. But what kind of, is there anything you say about the time scale in which insects live? Is a day like an epic amount of time for them, or do they process faster?
I think that depends on the species you're talking about.
Okay.
A monarch butterfly, for instance, lives about a year. A lot of butterflies live a few days, a week. Okay. Some of them live several months. Some of the I'm trying to think of the ones that live a really long time.
Well, I guess something like cicadas that have like a long...
Yeah, they have a really long life cycle. So, or think about a tree, you know?
Right.
A tree responds to things and we don't even realize everything that they respond to, but they're on a much, much slower time frame.
Right.
So insects are on a completely different matrix. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, you had talked about the eyes and compound eyes. And I always say, now you have 2 eyes. Do you see 2 of everything? Technically, right. You do, but your brain puts it together.
Puts it together. So these are like maybe pixels that assemble, you know.
Right. So they have a much wider perspective on things than we do.
Right.
And
in terms of field of view.
Field of view, and they are also tuned into particular frequencies. So they're seeing the plant frequencies, and they're seeing UV. They're seeing things that we aren't even conscious of. And there is a difference, believe it or not, at least with butterflies, between how the males are seeing and how the females are seeing. And that's one of the classic jokes. Males and females see differently. Yes, they do. So the females are generally looking for host plants for the caterpillars to lay their eggs. The males are looking for females. So they're looking for completely different things, but you can see that in their eyes. In fact, we're working on a paper right now about that. But they are on a completely different time frame, completely different chemical awareness. We're being bombarded with all kinds of stuff that we're not even conscious of.
Right. Well, I did have a moment of what seemed like a visionary intuition about or a case of seeing something happening with a plant on a different time scale. And I was down in Bisbee, Arizona, and there were all these agave plants, and that they apparently have a life cycle where every 13 years they send out this one blossom. And I was just looking, it's beautiful. And then it dies. And so I was looking at this stalk that's coming up with this beautiful pink and purple flower. I forget what colors it was. And I suddenly realized that this looks like the soul leaving the body at death. It's like, here's the silver cord, and now here's the spirit body, and it's sending its pollen out, it's sending its spirit out, and then it will die once it does that. And so it's a lot of why we may be prejudiced against certain life forms or not see as much consciousness in them is it may be much harder to recognize consciousness that's happening at a radically different time scale than our time scale.
That's a good observation. I like it. One of our philosophers, Maimonides, 11th century rabbi and physician, said there is nothing in nature that is without purpose, meaning, or anyway. I'll have to find it, but the whole thing, there's nothing in nature that is meaningless.
Right.
Without purpose. Every single thing has some purpose and some activity, and that's what we were talking about.
Right.
The whole coherence of the planet.
I have trouble seeing that sometimes for, say, bed bugs, spirochetes and stuff like that.
They obviously have a purpose. They evolved.
Right.
And maybe it's the bed that wasn't here 1,000 years ago.
And I am interested in parasites. I mean, there is this thing called the Red Queen hypothesis you've probably heard of that says that, sexual differentiation may have been an adaptation to parasites. And so from a sufficiently large vantage, even the most annoying parasites could be revealed to be evolutionary symbionts and creating an antagonistic force that spurs on evolution. And so I guess we covered compound vision. So I know that spiders are not insects, but are arachnoids. But they do seem like they have a lot of in people's minds, including mine, that they sort of seem like they're in the same category. Where are they in terms of higher and lower? Are they more complex, more intelligent and purposive, and with individual consciousness, or do you have any sense of what's going on with spiders?
That's putting a value on one insect over another. I think, first of all, spiders are very, very old, but I'll tell you a story about spiders. Look this up on the internet. Peacock spiders.
Okay.
And they do these beautiful little dances to impress the female, just like a peacock bird.
Okay.
They're just amazing.
Wow.
There's another species of spider in South America and Central America. I can't remember the scientist's name now, but the spider actually, he's a little spider. He builds a big spider in his net. He builds one with lichen and pieces of...
like a scarecrow spider?
Yeah. And it has 8 legs, just like a spider. He builds it, and he sits in the middle. Now, we don't know exactly what it is he's doing, but he builds a spider. So this is not an unintelligent animal. And speaking of migration, there's a certain amount of intelligence that has to take place for an animal to migrate thousands of miles.
Right.
And so nobody's ever going to convince me that insects are stupid. They may be smarter than we are in some ways.
Well, I mean, they definitely have amazing survival skills that they've culled over so many more generations than we've been around. That definitely has to be handed to them. Okay, we're running out of time, but what are the questions about insects that you wish I would have asked, or what are some of the most interesting things about insect consciousness that you think people should know that we haven't covered?
Well, the first thing I think is just that we have to remember that they're operating on a different scale than we are, whether it's time, energy, chemical awareness, everything. They're just in a completely different matrix. They may be a parallel universe, I don't know.
Right.
But that they are doing something very, very important in holding the planet together in ways that we don't even sometimes know. But I'm reminded of E.O. Wilson, somebody asking him, many, many, many years ago, is, well, what good are ants anyway? And his reply was, what good are you?
Right.
And I think that's what we need to remember, is we need to be putting back into the matrix instead of constantly taking out. So I think that's a good answer.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note to close on. Thank you so much, Sandy, for talking to us about insects.
Thank you for asking.
And this is Jonathan Zapp of ZappOracle.com and Reality Sandwich signing off. Thank you for listening.